Every autumn, somewhere in this country, a homeowner grabs a chainsaw and kills one of the most useful wild plants in North America. The deep red cones on its branches taste like cold lemonade. Native tribes drank this for centuries. English gardeners paid serious money to grow it 400 years ago. Why does it still get cut down today? A neighbor warned them. An internet article told them to. Or the name alone just sounded dangerous enough that nobody asked any further questions before reaching for the saw. The shrub they are destroying grows tall clusters of deep red cones pointed upward like little torches lit at the tip of every branch. Crushed and dried, those cones become a tart, ruby-colored spice that gives Middle Eastern cooking its signature tang. The plant still grows wild for free across more than 30 states, along nearly every dry roadside and field edge in the country. So why do so many Americans look at it and reach for a saw instead of a basket? The answer is one word: sumac. In a case of mistaken identity nearly 4 centuries in the making. Welcome to the vault. This story does not start with a chainsaw. It starts with a name that 2 completely different plants were unlucky enough to share, and a chain of misunderstanding that has run unbroken for generations. Poison sumac is real. It is genuinely dangerous, and the blistering rash it leaves behind can be worse than poison ivy. The fear is not invented out of thin air, but here's where the trouble begins. Poison sumac and staghorn sumac are not the same plant. They are not even close. The only thing they truly share is half of a name. They do sit in the same broad plant family, the one botanists call Anacardiaceae. That family also includes cashews, mangoes, and pistachios. It includes poison ivy, too. So somewhere along the line, the logic became simple and simply wrong. Sumac sounds like poison sumac. Poison sumac is related to poison ivy. Therefore, all sumac must be trouble. We learned to throw out the cashew because it had a difficult cousin. And once a fear like that takes hold, it gets passed down like a family recipe. From a cautious parent to a cautious child, until nobody remembers where it started. Here's the detail almost everyone misses. Telling these 2 plants apart is not hard. It might be the easiest plant identification you will ever make in your life. Staghorn sumac holds its berries in tight, upright cones, deep crimson, pointed toward the sky like little torches lit at the tip of every branch. The young branches are covered in soft fuzz, the same velvet texture you would feel on a deer's antler in early summer, which is exactly where the staghorn name comes from. In fall, its long, feathery, fern-like leaves turn a brilliant scarlet you can spot from a moving car 100 yards away. It favors dry, sunny, open ground. Roadsides, field edges, old pastures, the bright, well-drained places that bake in full summer sun, and that most other shrubs find too harsh to colonize. Poison sumac does the opposite of all of that, in nearly every measurable way. Its berries are white or pale gray-green, and they hang down loose and drooping from slender stems, never standing up in tight cones. Its branches are smooth with no fuzz at all, nothing resembling velvet or antler texture anywhere on the plant. And it will only grow with its feet wet, in swamps, bogs, and standing water, habitats that staghorn sumac actively avoids. If you're standing on dry land at the edge of a road, on a hillside, in an open field, you are almost certainly not looking at poison sumac at all, because the plant simply does not grow in that kind of ground. The whole rule fits in a single breath. Red cones standing up on dry ground, safe. White berries drooping down in a swamp, leave it be. That is the entire test. Whole generations cut down a harmless, useful shrub because nobody ever taught them the part that takes 10 seconds to learn. Stay with me, because what comes next is the part most people never hear at all. Long before anyone feared this plant, the native people of this continent treasured it. Native nations from the Cherokee to the Ojibwe to the Iroquois used staghorn sumac as food and medicine for centuries. They soaked the red cones in cool water to make a tart, rose-colored drink so close to lemonade that early settlers called it Indian lemonade and drank it all through summer heat. The ethnobotanist Daniel Norman, who spent decades documenting how Native Americans used wild plants, recorded staghorn sumac entry after entry. From a cooling beverage to a wash for sore throats, and the tartness you taste is real chemistry. The surface of each berry is coated in malic acid and ascorbic acid. Ascorbic acid is vitamin C, the same acid that gives apples their tang and citrus fruit. Its sourness sits concentrated on the fuzzy outer coating of every staghorn sumac berry, which is exactly why a quick cold water soak pulls so much bright flavor out of something that looks, at first glance, like nothing more than a dried red cluster. Sailors and frontier families leaned on sour wild fruits like this one to hold off scurvy when fresh food ran out across a long winter. The dried cones kept their tang for months, which made them a quiet kind of insurance against scarcity. Long before anyone understood vitamin deficiency as a medical concept, people understood that the tart red berries growing along the dry roadside in autumn would still taste sharp and bright in February. Long after the garden had gone dormant and the orchard had been picked clean, that kind of practical knowledge, passed down through direct experience rather than written science, kept entire communities through winters that modern grocery store logistics make almost impossible to imagine. Now here is the irony that should sting a little. While generations of Americans were learning to fear it, Europeans were paying handsomely to plant it. By the time the English herbalist John Parkinson was cataloging garden plants in 1629, this American shrub was already a prized ornamental across the wealthy gardens of England, grown for its torch-like cones and its blazing autumn color that no native European shrub could quite match. A century later, the botanist Carl Linnaeus gave it its formal scientific name, Rus tifina, in the 1750s, cementing its place in the formal botanical record as a plant worth studying, cataloging, and cultivating. The plant your neighbor wants to cut down today was once a status symbol in the finest gardens of London, planted deliberately by people who had crossed an ocean's worth of distance to acquire seed stock for a shrub that, on its native continent, was simply growing wild along every dusty roadside for free. It is worth sitting with that contrast for a moment. The same plant, the same berries, the same chemistry, the same growth habit, the same autumn display of brilliant color. On one side of the Atlantic, a treasured ornamental specimen, sourced deliberately, planted with care, admired by visitors to the grand estates that could afford to cultivate it. On the other side, increasingly, a plant treated as a threat, removed on sight, never given the chance to display the exact qualities that made it valuable enough to import in the first place. And those red cones do far more than make a drink or decorate a garden. This is where the story leaves the backyard and lands squarely on your dinner plate. If you have ever eaten za'atar, that earthy, tangy spice blend dusted over warm flatbread and roasted vegetables across the Middle East, you have already tasted sumac. The bright lemony note in that blend comes from dried, ground sumac berries. The spice you buy in the jar usually comes from a Mediterranean cousin in the very same genus, Rus coriaria, grown commercially across Turkey, Iran, Lebanon, and Sicily for exactly this purpose. But the staghorn sumac growing wild on the American roadside carries that same sharp, tart flavor produced by the same family of organic acids working through the same chemistry. Cooks dust the deep red powder over hummus, over grilled meats, over rice and roasted vegetables, both for the tang and for that gorgeous color that no synthetic food coloring quite replicates. Picture this. People drive to the grocery store and pay as premium for a small imported jar of ground sumac spice. While the same flavor, the same chemistry, the same plant family sits ignored on the shrub they have been trying to bulldoze out of the yard. Restaurant supply stores price specialty sumac spice at several dollars per ounce. A single staghorn sumac shrub in full cone produces enough material to fill several spice jars, every single autumn, indefinitely, requiring nothing from the person harvesting it beyond the willingness to pick, dry, and grind. It also happens to be one of the more antioxidant-rich spices on that shelf, which is part of why the rest of the world never stopped using it. Research on sumac's polyphenol content has found concentrations that place it among the more potent antioxidant spices available, comparable to or exceeding many of the more celebrated culinary herbs that get far more attention in nutrition conversations. The plant that gets cut down in American backyards is, by the measurements that matter to nutritionists studying antioxidant capacity, doing more for the people destroying it than most of what survives in their pantry. For most of American history, none of this was a secret, and none of it was special. It was simply ordinary. Staghorn sumac was the plain, everyday shrub at the edge of the field. Its bark and leaves are heavy with tannins, and tanners once used it to cure leather, while dyers used it to set color into cloth. A practical industrial use that persisted well into the 20th century in some rural communities before synthetic tanning compounds made the traditional method obsolete. Nobody wrote songs about it. It was just there, useful, reliable, standing quietly at the corner of every dry lot in the country, doing several jobs at once without anyone needing to think twice about it. And maybe that is how a plant slips out of memory, not with a government ban and not with a scandal, but with a slow collective shrug, one generation at a time, until all that is left is the half of the name that frightened people. So let's bring it home, because making that famous lemonade is genuinely simple, simple enough that children have been doing it unsupervised for as long as anyone can remember. You want the deep red cones from late summer into early fall, when the color has fully developed and the tart coating has had time to concentrate. Pick them on a dry day, because a hard rain washes away the tart coating that holds all the flavor. The same acids that make the drink work sit on the surface of the fuzzy berries, exposed and water-soluble, vulnerable to the first heavy rain of the season. A cluster picked the morning after, a storm will taste flat and disappointing compared to the same cluster picked after several dry days in a row. Snap off a few cones, break them apart into a jar of cool or room temperature water. Let them soak for 10 to 20 minutes, and you will watch the water slowly blush a deep pink, the color deepening the longer you wait, the way tea darkens as it steeps. Then strain it through a coffee filter or a clean cloth, which catches the fine little hairs that coat the berries, and that would otherwise leave the finished drink slightly gritty. Sweeten it however you like, with sugar, honey, or nothing at all if you prefer it sharp. One piece of advice matters more than any other here, and it is the single detail that separates a good batch from a ruined one. Use cool water, never boiling. Hot water drags the bitter tannins out of the plant along with the desirable acids, and turns your bright lemonade harsh and mouth-puckering in a way no amount of added sugar can fully fix. Cold steeping keeps it clean and tart, the same way native families made it for generations, long before anyone had the scientific vocabulary to explain why temperature mattered so much to the final result. And if you dry those cones and grind them, you have just made your own jar of that expensive imported spice for nothing. A few practical notes worth knowing before you go looking. The cones you want are deep red, dense, and slightly sticky to the touch, the surface coating visibly intact rather than dull or faded. Pale, washed-out clusters that have already been hit by rain have lost most of their tartness and are not worth gathering, no matter how large or impressive the cone itself looks from a distance. Each cone can be reused for a second, lighter batch of lemonade if you do not have access to more. The flavor will be subtler, but still pleasant, a fine way to stretch a small harvest across 2 pitchers instead of 1. Take only what you need and leave plenty of cones behind for the birds that lean on them through the winter months, when food is otherwise scarce across much of the staghorn sumacs range. A single mature staghorn sumac can produce dozens of cones in a season, more than enough for both you and the wildlife that has depended on this exact shrub for centuries. If you want to use the spice rather than the drink, the process is just as simple. Spread the dried cones on a tray in a single layer, and let them air dry completely, which can take 1 to 2 weeks depending on humidity in your area. Once fully dry, grind the cones in a spice grinder or with a mortar and pestle. Then sift out the larger seeds and stem fragments through a fine strainer, leaving behind the deep red powder that is the spice itself, ready to use exactly the way you would use the imported version. Stored in a sealed jar away from light, this powder holds its color and tartness for a year or more. The same shelf life as the imported version, sold for a premium at any specialty grocery store. Made from a closely related plant that grows on a different continent, for no better reason than that it happened to be the species nearest the people who first started selling it commercially. So go back to that homeowner with the saw. The plant they were about to destroy makes a free summer drink rich in vitamin C. It carries the very flavor people pay good money for in a jar at a specialty grocery store. And it once stood proud in the finest gardens of Europe, sought after by people who never had the chance to find it growing wild and free the way it grows in an American field today. The only thing ever truly wrong with it was a name it never chose for itself. A half-syllable of misfortune that attached it to a different, more dangerous plant through nothing more than linguistic coincidence. Think about how much was lost to that coincidence. Generations of families who could have been making a free summer drink instead spent money on imported lemonade mix. Generations of cooks who could have been grinding their own spice from the shrub at the edge of their own property instead drove to specialty grocery stores for small jars of the same flavor. Imported from across an ocean at a markup that the wild version never required. Generations of birds that depend on those cones through the leanest months of winter lost a food source every time a homeowner cleared a stand of staghorn sumac because a neighbor mentioned the word poison. This season, when the leaves begin to turn and you spot those brilliant red cones standing tall along a dry roadside, you will know exactly what you're seeing. Not a threat. A glass of lemonade that has been waiting on the branch the whole time. Ready for anyone willing to spend 10 seconds learning the difference between a torch-shaped cone on dry ground and a drooping white berry in a swamp. If this vault changed how you see the wild plants in your own world, subscribe and stay close. There's a whole continent of forgotten plants still out there, and the next one will be waiting for you right here.